I am often asked how I came to write this book. One reason is that after 20 years of teaching history and political science, I wanted to write a different kind of history book, one that was different from the ones I had had in school and the ones given to students across the country. By that time, I knew that there was no such thing as a pure fact. Behind every fact that a teacher or writer presents to the world is a judgment. The judgment says, this fact is important, and other facts, which I am leaving out, are not important. I thought that some of the things that had been left out of most history books were important. The beginning of the Declaration of Independence says that we, the people, wrote the document. But the authors of the Declaration were really 55 privileged white men. They belonged to a class that wanted a strong central government to protect their interests. Right down to this day, government has been used to serve the needs of the wealthy and powerful. This fact is hidden by language that suggests that all of us, rich and poor and middle class, want the same thing. Race is another issue. I did not realize when I first started to study history how badly twisted the teaching and writing of history had become by ignoring non-white people. Yes, the Indians were there, and then they were gone. Black people were visible when they were slaves, then they were freed, and then they became invisible. It was a white man's history. Massacres of Indians and of Black people got little attention, if they were mentioned at all. Other themes and issues were also overlooked in the standard mainstream telling of history. The suffering of the poor did not get much attention. Wars were plentiful, but histories did not tell us much about the men and women and children on all sides who were killed or crippled when leaders made the decision to go to war. The struggles for justice by Latino people in California and the Southwest were often ignored. So were the claims of gay and lesbian people for their rights, and the change in the national culture that they brought about. The title of this book is not quite accurate. A people's history promises more than any one person can deliver, and it is the hardest kind of history to recapture. I call it that anyway because, with all its limits, it is a history that is disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance. Most history books suggest that in times of crisis, we must look to someone to save us. In the Revolutionary crisis, the Founding Fathers saved us. In the Civil War, Lincoln saved us. In the Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt saved us. Our role is just to go to voting booths every 4 years. But from time to time, Americans reject the idea of a savior. They feel their own strength and they rebel. So far, their rebellions have been contained. The establishment, a club of business leaders, generals, and politicians, has always managed to keep up the pretense of national unity, with a government that claims to represent all the people. But the establishment would like Americans to forget the times when people who seemed helpless were able to resist, and people who seemed content demanded change. Blacks, women, Indians, young people, working people, all have found ways to make their voices heard and to bring about change. Most histories say little about revolt. They place the emphasis on the acts of leaders, not the actions of ordinary citizens. But history that keeps alive the memory of people's resistance suggests new kinds of power. Imagine the American people united for the first time in a movement for fundamental change. Imagine society's power taken away from the giant corporations, the military, and the politicians who answer to corporate and military interests. We would need to rebuild the economy for efficiency and justice. We would start on our neighborhoods, cities, and workplaces. Work would be found for everyone. Society would benefit from the enormous energy, skill, and talent that is now unused. The basics, food, housing, healthcare, education, transportation, would be available to all. The great problem would be to bring about all this change through cooperation, not through systems of reward and punishment. Social movements of the past give hints of how people might behave if they were working together to build a new society. Decisions would be made by small groups of people working as equals. Perhaps a new, diverse, nonviolent culture would develop over time. The values of cooperation and freedom would shape people's relationships with one another and the raising of their children. All of this takes us far from history, into the realm of imagination. But it is not totally removed from history. There are glimpses of such possibilities in the past. In the labor movement, for example, or the freedom rides, or the cultural changes of the 1960s and 1970s. Two forces are now rushing toward the future. One wears a splendid uniform. It is the official past, with all its violence, war, prejudices against those who are different, hoarding of the good earth's wealth by a few, and political power in the hands of liars and murderers. The other force is ragged but inspired. It is the people's past, with its history of resistance, civil disobedience against the military machine, protests against racism, multiculturalism, and growing anger against endless wars. Which of these forces will win the future? It is a race we can all choose to join or just to watch. But we should know that our choice will help determine the outcome. Women garment workers in New York City at the start of the 20th century gained inspiration for their own movement of resistance from the words of the poet Shelley. Rise like lions after slumber in a vanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.